The bright airport terminal buzzed with activity as Staff Sergeant Grace Wilson made her way to the boarding gate. Her uniform was pressed and neat, a stark contrast to the exhaustion etched across her face. 14 months in a foreign desert had taken their toll. Her shoulders ached from carrying her military backpack. But more than physical fatigue, she carried the weight of missed birthdays, holidays, and countless family dinners. Almost home, she whispered to herself, a small smile forming on her tired face. Grace checked her watch, still 30 minutes before boarding. She found a quiet corner near the gate and pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos of her family. Her younger sister had sent pictures from last week's Sunday dinner. Everyone gathered around their parents' dining table, smiling at the camera with an empty chair visible in the corner. Her chair. Grace swallowed hard. She would fill that chair soon. The deployment had been longer than expected. What started as a 9-month tour stretched into 14, when her unit's replacement was delayed. But through it all, Grace had kept a special plan in her back pocket, a little luxury she'd promised herself. 3 months into her deployment, during a particularly rough week when temperatures had soared above 115 degrees and her unit had worked 18-hour shifts, Grace had made herself a promise. She would fly home in first class, not because she felt entitled or special, but because after more than a year of sleeping on a cot in a shared tent, eating meals from paper trays and showering in facilities that barely deserved the name, she wanted just a few hours of comfort before reuniting with her family. So each month, she had set aside a portion of her pay. The first-class ticket had cost nearly 2 months' salary, but as Grace saw it, this wasn't just a seat on a plane. It was her transition back to civilian life, a buffer between war and home. Now boarding Group A for Flight 283 to Chicago, the gate agent announced, her voice cutting through Grace's thoughts. Grace gathered her things, double-checking her boarding pass. Group A, Seat 3C, first class. She joined the line, feeling a flutter of excitement despite her fatigue. When she reached the front, she handed her boarding pass and military ID to the gate agent, a young man with a friendly smile. "Thank you for your service," he said with genuine appreciation, scanning her documents. "Have a great flight, Staff Sergeant Wilson." Grace nodded her thanks and walked down the jetway. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant with perfectly styled hair and a crisp blue uniform greeted passengers with practiced efficiency. "Welcome aboard," she said, barely glancing at Grace's boarding pass before directing her toward the right. The first-class cabin looked exactly as Grace had imagined during those long desert nights. Wide leather seats with actual legroom, real glasses instead of plastic cups. Passengers already settling in looked relaxed and comfortable. Grace found 3C and stored her backpack in the overhead bin. As she was about to sit down, another flight attendant approached her, this one older with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me," the woman said, looking at Grace's uniform and then down at a tablet in her hand. "May I see your boarding pass?" Grace handed it over, noticing how the attendant's eyes narrowed slightly as she reviewed it. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your seating assignment," the flight attendant said, her voice lowering. "If you could come with me for a moment." Grace followed the woman to the front galley area, away from the other first-class passengers. "I'm showing that this seat has been reassigned," the flight attendant explained, tapping on her tablet. "You've been moved to 24B in economy." Grace blinked in confusion. "There must be a mistake. I purchased this first-class ticket months ago." The flight attendant's smile remained fixed. "I understand, but the system shows a change was made. Perhaps there was an email notification." Grace pulled out her phone and opened her email. "I have the original confirmation right here," she said, showing the screen with her first-class seat assignment. "I never received any notification about changes." A man in a business suit walked past them, settling into seat 2A without a second glance. "I'll need to check with the gate," the flight attendant said, stepping away to use the phone. Grace stood awkwardly in the galley, feeling increasingly out of place as more first-class passengers boarded, some giving her curious looks as they passed. After a few minutes, the flight attendant returned. "I'm sorry, but the gate confirmed the change. Your new seat is 24B. Someone from customer service can assist you after the flight regarding the circumstances of the change." Grace felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and frustration. "But I specifically saved for this seat." I'm coming back from a 14-month deployment and I understand, the flight attendant interrupted, though her tone suggested otherwise. But the flight is full, and I need to ask you to take your assigned seat. We're behind schedule as it is. Grace wanted to argue further but noticed other passengers watching now. The last thing she wanted was to create a scene or be that person holding up an entire flight. With a deep breath, she retrieved her backpack from the overhead bin. Could you at least tell me why my seat was changed? Grace asked, keeping her voice steady. The flight attendant glanced around before leaning slightly closer. The system shows a priority reassignment code. That usually means the seat was needed for another passenger with status. Grace nodded slowly, understanding what wasn't being said. Someone more important, likely a frequent flyer with elite status or connections to the airline, had been given her seat. The walk back through first class felt endless. Each passenger she passed seemed to represent the comfort she had saved for and been denied. By the time she reached economy, most of the overhead bins were full. A flight attendant in the economy section helped her find space for her backpack, 3 rows behind her assigned seat. Grace squeezed into 24B, a middle seat between a large man who had already claimed the armrest and a woman deeply focused on her tablet. The seat was narrow, with barely enough legroom for her 5'7" frame, a far cry from what she had planned and paid for. As the safety demonstration began, Grace tried to focus on the positive. She was still going home, still leaving the dust and danger behind. But the sting of injustice remained, not because she felt entitled to special treatment as a soldier, but because she had worked hard and paid for something that had been taken away without explanation or proper compensation. The plane began to taxi, and Grace closed her eyes, trying to calm her emotions. She thought of her family waiting at home, her mom's cooking, her dad's bear hugs, her sister's endless stories. That was what mattered, not a few hours in a nicer seat. But when she opened her eyes, she noticed the businessman across the aisle looking at her with an odd expression. He had been at the gate earlier and had seen her boarding in Group A. Now he glanced between her uniform and her cramped middle seat, his brow furrowed in confusion. Grace turned away, gazing out the window over her seatmate's shoulder as the plane accelerated down the runway. She didn't notice the businessman discreetly taking a photo of her boarding pass stub that was peeking from her uniform pocket, or him typing rapidly on his phone before takeoff. The plane lifted into the air, leaving the military base that had been Grace's home for over a year growing smaller below. She should have felt only relief and excitement, but there was a heaviness in her chest that hadn't been there when she boarded. The drink service began, and the economy flight attendant reached her row. "What would you like to drink?" she asked Grace. "Just water, please," Grace replied. The attendant noticed her uniform and paused. "Coming home?" she asked with a genuine smile. Grace nodded. 14 months. "Welcome home," the attendant said warmly, handing her a full can of water instead of the usual partial pour. It was a small gesture, but it brought a lump to Grace's throat. As the flight continued, Grace tried to get comfortable in the cramped seat. She thought about the money she'd spent, money that could have gone toward a nice dinner with her family or even started the laptop fund she'd been planning for her return to school next year. She wasn't wealthy. Every dollar mattered. The large man beside her had fallen asleep, his body now taking up even more space. Grace pressed herself against the opposite armrest, trying to create any separation she could. 30 minutes into the flight, she noticed the businessman across the aisle still watching her. He caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring smile before returning to his laptop. Grace didn't know what to make of it, but something about his expression made her feel less alone. She pulled out the novel she'd brought for the flight, the paperback she'd carried through her entire deployment, but never had time to read. Now, squashed in economy with her knees pressed against the seat in front, unable to even fully open the book without elbowing her neighbors, Grace tried to lose herself in the story, but her mind kept returning to the first-class seat she'd saved for, to the flight attendant's dismissive tone, to the faceless priority passenger who now sat where she should have been. Grace sighed and closed her book. It wasn't about the luxury, not really. It was about the principle, about a promise she'd made to herself during difficult times, a promise that had now been broken by someone else's decision. As the drink cart made another pass, Grace gazed out the window at the clouds below. Whatever happened with the seat, she was still going home. In a few hours, none of this would matter. But as the plane continued eastward, she couldn't help wondering who had deemed her unworthy of the seat she'd paid for, and whether they gave any thought to the soldier they had displaced. Across the aisle, Thomas Lee checked his watch and frowned. He'd been watching the soldier since boarding, and something about the situation bothered him deeply. As the senior vice president of a tech company, Thomas spent more time in the air than on the ground. He knew airline policies inside and out, and what he had just witnessed didn't add up. He had seen the young woman board with the first group, watched her store her backpack in the first-class cabin, and then oddly be escorted back to economy. The confusion and disappointment on her face told the whole story. Thomas pulled out his phone, switching it to airplane mode but opening his notes app. He was a problem solver by nature. It was what made him good at his job. And this felt like a problem that needed solving. The drink cart stopped at his row, and the flight attendant smiled. "What can I get you, sir?" "Just coffee, black, thanks," Thomas replied before adding, "Quick question, that soldier across the aisle, wasn't she originally seated in first class?" The flight attendant glanced at Grace, then lowered her voice. "I'm not sure about the details, but there was some kind of seating reassignment before takeoff." Thomas nodded, taking the coffee. "Thanks." As the attendant moved on, he opened his laptop and connected to the plane's Wi-Fi. The airline's customer service page loaded slowly. While waiting, he glanced again at Grace, who was trying to find a comfortable position in her cramped middle seat. Her neighbor had fallen asleep and was leaning heavily against her shoulder. Thomas had grown up in a military family. His father had served for 20 years, and Thomas had vivid memories of his dad returning from long deployments, exhausted but relieved to be home. The military didn't pay well. Thomas knew that firsthand. If that soldier had purchased a first-class ticket, it represented a significant financial sacrifice. The customer service page finally loaded. Thomas typed a brief, factual message explaining what he had witnessed and requesting information about the airline's policy on seat reassignments for military personnel. He didn't make accusations or demands, just asked questions in a professional tone. After sending the message, he pulled up his contacts list and composed a text to his old college roommate, Patrick, who now worked as an executive at the same airline, on Flight 283 to Chicago. "Just watched a soldier returning from deployment get bumped from her first-class seat without explanation. Thought you might want to know. Not looking to cause trouble. Just seems wrong." He attached the photo he'd discreetly taken of Grace's boarding pass stub and hit send before the plane reached the altitude where cell service cut out. Thomas then opened his work email, intending to catch up on messages, but found himself unable to focus. Across the aisle, Grace had given up trying to read her book in the confined space and was now staring out the window with a distant expression. Thomas recognized that look, the 1,000-yard stare his father sometimes had after returning from deployment. Not quite present, caught between two worlds. The Wi-Fi connection finally stabilized and a notification appeared on his phone. A customer service representative had responded to his inquiry. "Thank you for your message. We value all our customers, including our military personnel. Seat assignments may change due to operational requirements. If the customer has concerns, they should contact customer service after the flight." A corporate non-answer. Thomas wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. He was about to close the message when his phone chimed with an incoming text from Patrick. Looking into it now, this shouldn't have happened. "What's her name if you know it?" Thomas realized he didn't know her name. He glanced at Grace again, noticing the name tape on her uniform was partially obscured by her hair. He needed a reason to talk to her. Thomas noticed Grace's empty water cup and his own untouched bottle of water that the flight attendant had left alongside his coffee. "Excuse me," he said, catching her attention. "Would you like this water?" "They always give me both and I never drink it." Grace looked surprised at being addressed. "Oh, sure. Thank you." Thomas passed the bottle across the aisle. "I'm Thomas, by the way." "Grace," she replied with a small smile. "Grace Wilson, coming home from deployment?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Grace nodded. 14 months in the desert. Beyond ready to be home, I bet. My dad was Army, 20 years. I remember those homecomings." Thomas paused, then decided to be direct. "I couldn't help noticing earlier. Weren't you originally seated in first class?" Grace's expression fell slightly. "Yeah, saved up for it as a coming-home gift to myself. But apparently there was some kind of priority reassignment, whatever that means." Did they offer any compensation? A refund for the difference in fare? They said to talk to customer service after the flight, Grace said with a shrug that suggested she didn't have high hopes. Thomas nodded, his suspicions confirmed. Well, for what it's worth, I think that's pretty lousy treatment, especially for someone coming home after serving for over a year. It's fine, Grace said automatically, though her voice suggested it wasn't. I'm still going home, that's what matters. Thomas smiled. He liked her attitude, but that didn't make the situation right. True, but you paid for a service you didn't receive. That's just bad business. He quickly texted Patrick back with Grace's name, then returned to their conversation. So where's home? Chicago suburbs, Grace replied. My parents and sister are picking me up at the airport. They don't know I'm coming today, they think I'm arriving next week. Wanted to surprise them. That's great, Thomas said genuinely. They must have missed you. And I missed them, Grace said, her face softening. 14 months is a long time. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the interphone. A flight attendant picked up at the front of the economy cabin, listened, and then made her way down the aisle, scanning seat numbers. To Thomas's surprise, she stopped at their row. Staff Sergeant Wilson? She asked, looking at Grace. Grace straightened in her seat. Yes? Would you please come with me? Bring your belongings. Grace looked confused and a little wary. Is something wrong? Not at all, the flight attendant said with a genuine smile. Just need you to come with me for a moment. Grace collected her things and followed the attendant toward the front of the plane. Thomas watched them go, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His phone buzzed with another text from Patrick. Situation being addressed. Thanks for flagging. Up at the front of the plane, the lead flight attendant, a different one from before, was waiting for Grace in the galley between economy and first class. Staff Sergeant Wilson, she said warmly. I'm Lisa, the lead on this flight. There's been a misunderstanding with your seating assignment. Grace braced herself, wondering what new problem had arisen. Your first-class seat was never meant to be reassigned, Lisa explained. We've received several calls about the situation, including one from our executive offices. Your original seat, 3C, is available and waiting for you. We sincerely apologize for the confusion. Grace blinked in surprise. Oh, thank you. Additionally, Lisa continued, the airline would like to offer you a voucher for a future flight as a goodwill gesture for the inconvenience. Still stunned, Grace followed Lisa through the curtain that separated economy from first class. As they entered the premium cabin, several passengers looked up, including an older gentleman in an expensive suit sitting in 4A. Excuse me, he said, stopping Lisa. Is this the soldier who was moved from first class? Lisa nodded. Yes, sir. We're correcting the situation now. The man looked at Grace. I heard what happened. Completely unacceptable. I fly over 100,000 miles a year with this airline, and I've never seen anything like it. He extended his hand to Grace. Thank you for your service. Grace shook his hand, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the attention. Other first-class passengers murmured their agreement. Here we are, 3C, Lisa said, gesturing to Grace's original seat, which now had a small amenity kit placed on it that hadn't been there before. Can I get you something to drink once you're settled? Just water is fine, Grace said, still processing the sudden turn of events as she stored her backpack. As she sat down in the wide, comfortable seat she had saved so long for, Grace noticed several of the first-class flight attendants huddled in conversation at the front, occasionally glancing her way. One of them approached with a glass of water and a warm smile that was nothing like the tight, dismissive expression of the attendant who had removed her earlier. Staff Sergeant Wilson, we want to personally apologize for what happened, she said quietly. It should never have occurred. We're looking into exactly how the error was made. Thank you, Grace said. I appreciate that. As the attendant walked away, Grace stretched her legs out in the ample space before her, the tension of the past hour finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. She still didn't understand exactly what had happened or why she had been moved in the first place, but the comfort she had saved for was now restored. Grace glanced back toward economy class, wanting to thank Thomas for his kindness, but couldn't see him from her seat. She made a mental note to find him before deplaning. Unknown to Grace, back in economy, Thomas was on his laptop, typing an email to his company's travel department. The subject line read, "New Corporate Travel Policy Proposal, Military Personnel Upgrades." The incident had sparked an idea. His company spent millions on business travel each year. What if a small percentage of that went toward upgrading service members when seats were available? He began outlining the concept, occasionally glancing toward first class where Grace was now being treated with the respect she deserved. Thomas didn't know it yet, but his simple act of speaking up was about to set in motion a chain of events that would reach far beyond this single flight. And for Grace, what had started as a disappointing homecoming was transforming into something entirely unexpected. Grace settled into her first-class seat, still trying to process the sudden reversal of her situation. The wide leather seat enveloped her comfortably, a stark contrast to the cramped middle seat she'd been squeezed into just minutes earlier. She took a sip of water from the real glass the flight attendant had provided, enjoying the simple luxury. The flight attendant who had originally removed her from first class was nowhere to be seen. In her place, the lead flight attendant, Lisa, was providing attentive service with an almost apologetic enthusiasm. "Would you care for something to eat, Staff Sergeant Wilson?" Lisa asked, presenting a menu. "It's a shorter flight, but we have several options available." "Thank you," Grace said, accepting the menu. The whole situation felt surreal. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened behind the scenes to cause such a dramatic change in how she was being treated. As Grace was scanning the menu, her phone buzzed with a notification. The plane's Wi-Fi was now active. She hadn't planned to use it. The fee seemed like an unnecessary expense, but a message appeared on her screen. "Complimentary Wi-Fi access granted for this flight." Curious, Grace connected and saw she had several new notifications. Most surprising was an email from the airline's customer service department with the subject line, "Regarding your flight today, urgent." Grace opened it, her eyebrows rising as she read, "Dear Staff Sergeant Wilson, we have been made aware of the unfortunate incident regarding your seating assignment on today's flight. We want to assure you this situation is being addressed at the highest levels of our organization. The seat reassignment was made in error and violated our company policies. As a small token of our sincere apology, we have credited your account with 50,000 miles and a voucher for a future first-class flight. Additionally, our CEO would like to speak with you personally about your experience if you would be willing. Thank you for your service to our country. Sincerely, Customer Care Executive Team." Grace stared at her phone in disbelief. The CEO wanted to speak with her? How had this escalated so quickly? She had just wanted to get home in comfort after a long deployment, not cause a corporate crisis. Out of curiosity, Grace opened her social media app and was shocked to discover a hashtag trending, "Respect our troops." Clicking on it revealed hundreds of posts about her situation, many including a photo of her sitting uncomfortably in economy class in her uniform, taken from several rows back. "Oh no," she whispered, realizing the story had somehow gone viral while she was in the air. She scrolled through comments expressing outrage on her behalf, calls for boycotting the airline, and veterans sharing similar experiences. The airline's social media accounts were being flooded with angry messages. Grace felt a wave of anxiety. She hadn't wanted any of this. She just wanted to surprise her family and slip back into normal life. Now she was at the center of a social media storm. A soft ding sounded throughout the cabin as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. We're about halfway to Chicago now, flying over eastern Colorado. Weather looks good all the way in, and we should be arriving on time. Current temperature in Chicago is 72 degrees with clear skies. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of your flight." Grace put down her phone, trying to process everything. She decided to order a light meal, hoping it would help her regain some normalcy. As she ate, she noticed several other first-class passengers glancing her way with sympathetic smiles. The older businessman who had spoken up earlier stopped by her seat on his way to the lavatory. "Glad to see things worked out," he said quietly. "Shameful it happened in the first place." Grace thanked him with a polite nod, but she was beginning to feel uncomfortable with all the attention. She had never wanted to be a cause célèbre. After finishing her meal, Grace decided to stretch her legs. She walked toward the back of the plane, wanting to find Thomas to thank him properly. She suspected he might have had something to do with her sudden change in fortune. She spotted him in the same seat, focused intently on his laptop. When he looked up and saw her, a genuine smile spread across his face. "Staff Sergeant Wilson," he said. "I see justice has been served." Grace smiled back, lowering her voice. "I have a feeling you had something to do with that. Mind if I sit for a minute?" She gestured to the empty aisle seat beside him. "Please do," Thomas said, closing his laptop. Grace settled into the much less comfortable economy seat. "I wanted to thank you. I don't know exactly what you did, but I suspect you're the reason I'm back in my original seat." Thomas shrugged modestly. "I just made a phone call to an old friend who happens to work for the airline. Honestly, I've never seen such a quick response. I think your situation touched a nerve." "Apparently," Grace said with a sigh. "Have you seen what's happening online? Somehow a photo of me got posted and now there's this whole hashtag campaign." Thomas looked surprised. "Really? That was fast?" "Social media can be a powerful force. Too powerful sometimes," Grace said. "I'm not comfortable being the face of some viral outrage campaign. I just wanted to go home." Thomas nodded understandingly. "I get that. Public attention can be overwhelming, especially when you're not expecting it." "The airline's offering me miles vouchers, even a call with their CEO," Grace said. "It feels like overkill for a simple seat mix-up." Thomas's expression turned serious. "It wasn't simple, though. You paid for that seat. And speaking as someone who flies constantly for business, I can tell you what happened isn't standard procedure. Someone made a decision to bump you, and that's not right." Grace considered this. "Do you know why it happened?" Thomas hesitated. "My contact didn't give specifics, but reading between the lines, I got the impression your seat was given to someone with connections, possibly a friend or relative of a higher-up. That's why this blew up so quickly internally. It wasn't just bad customer service. It was an abuse of power." Grace frowned. The explanation made sense but didn't make her feel any better about the situation. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked. "About the CEO wanting to talk and all that?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "Part of me just wants to forget the whole thing and enjoy being home. But another part feels like I should say something. Not just for myself, but for other service members who might face similar situations without someone like you to speak up for them." Thomas smiled thoughtfully. "You know, I've been working on something since this happened." He opened his laptop again, showing Grace a document titled Military Travel Respect Initiative. "My company spends millions on corporate travel each year," he explained. "I'm proposing we partner with airlines to upgrade military personnel when seats are available and cover any additional costs. I think other companies might join if we started it." Grace read through the proposal, impressed by its scope and thoughtfulness. "This is amazing. You came up with all this just because of what happened to me." "You were the spark," Thomas said. "But I've been thinking about ways to better support military personnel for years. My dad never complained about his travel experiences, but I saw how exhausted he was after long flights in cramped seats when returning from deployments. This could make a real difference." Their conversation was interrupted by the seatbelt sign, illuminating and an announcement that they were beginning. "Their initial descent into Chicago. I should get back to my seat," Grace said, standing. "But thank you again, truly. And good luck with your initiative." "Before you go," Thomas said, handing her a business card, "if you're open to it, I'd love to keep you updated on this project, maybe even get your input as someone who served. No pressure, though." Grace took the card, tucking it into her uniform pocket. "I'd like that." As she made her way back to her first-class seat, Grace felt a complex mix of emotions. The discomfort of being thrust into an unexpected spotlight was still there. But so was a growing sense that perhaps her experience could lead to something meaningful. Back in her seat, Grace buckled up and gazed out the window as the vast landscape below gradually transformed from the flat plains of the Midwest to the more developed outskirts of Chicago. Somewhere down there, her family was going about their day, completely unaware that she was about to walk through their front door. That thought centered her. Despite the unexpected drama of the flight, nothing had changed about what mattered most. She was going home after 14 long months away. Everything else was secondary. As the plane descended further, Grace's phone buzzed again. It was a message from the airline's executive office, asking when would be a convenient time for the CEO to call. There was also a notification that her story had been picked up by several news outlets. Grace put her phone in airplane mode, deciding that all of that could wait. For the next few hours, She wanted to focus solely on the joy of reuniting with her family. What she didn't realize was that by the time the plane touched down, her story would have reached far beyond social media, and waiting at the gate in Chicago was something she never could have anticipated. The plane touched down smoothly at O'Hare International Airport. The slight bump as the wheels met the runway sending a flutter of excitement through Grace's chest. She was home. After 14 months in the desert, breathing recycled air in crowded barracks and eating meals from paper trays, she was finally back on American soil. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago," the captain announced over the intercom. "Local time is 2:15 p.m. and the temperature is a pleasant 72 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." Grace gazed out the window as the massive airport came into view. She had flown through O'Hare countless times, but today it looked different. Today it was the gateway to home. As the plane taxied to the gate, Lisa, the lead flight attendant, approached Grace's seat. "Staff Sergeant Wilson," she said quietly, leaning in so other passengers couldn't hear, "I wanted to let you know that there may be some attention waiting at the gate." Grace's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Lisa looked slightly uncomfortable. "Apparently your story has gotten quite a bit of traction in the last hour. Our ground staff reports there are several news crews at the terminal and—" She hesitated. "Some military veteran groups have organized a small welcome." "News crews?" Grace repeated, a knot forming in her stomach. She had hoped to slip through the airport unnoticed, catch a taxi to her parents' house in the suburbs, and surprise them. A quiet, private homecoming, that was all she wanted. "I'm sorry," Lisa said, seeming genuinely apologetic. "If you'd prefer, we can arrange for you to deplane through a different exit." Grace considered this for a moment. Part of her wanted to accept the offer, to avoid the cameras and the fuss. But another part of her remembered her conversation with Thomas about how this situation might help other service members if handled right. "No," Grace decided. "I'll go through the main gate. But thank you for the option." Lisa nodded. "For what it's worth, I think what happened to you was wrong, and I'm glad it's getting attention. Things like this need to change." The plane pulled up to the gate, and the familiar chime sounded as the seatbelt sign switched off. Normally, first-class passengers would be the first to deplane. But Grace found herself hesitating, suddenly nervous about what awaited her. "Take your time," Lisa assured her. Grace gathered her things slowly, watching as other passengers began filing off the plane. Several paused to shake her hand or thank her for her service as they passed. The older businessman who had spoken to her earlier stopped again. "Whatever's waiting out there," he said with a warm smile. "Remember, you've earned every bit of respect coming your way." Grace thanked him, touched by the unexpected support from a stranger. As the cabin emptied, she finally stood, straightened her uniform, and took a deep breath. Thomas appeared from economy class, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. "Ready for your public?" he asked with a small smile. "Not really," Grace admitted. "But I don't see much choice now." "Just be yourself," Thomas advised. "That's who they're here to support." Together, they walked through the empty first-class cabin toward the exit. The flight crew stood at attention as Grace passed, a small gesture that nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you for your service," the captain said, shaking her hand firmly at the aircraft door. And then it was time. Grace stepped through the jetway and into the terminal. She wasn't prepared for what awaited her. The gate area was filled with people. Some held signs, "Respect our troops" and "Welcome home, soldier." Others wore Veterans Organization jackets and caps. At the front stood a group of men and women in various military uniforms, active duty personnel from different branches who happened to be at the airport and had heard about what was happening. As Grace emerged, someone started applauding. Within seconds, the entire crowd joined in, a wave of supportive noise washing over her. Camera flashes popped. News crews jostled for position. Grace froze momentarily, overwhelmed by the attention. Then a path cleared through the crowd and she saw something that made her heart stop. Her family. They weren't supposed to be here. They thought she was arriving next week. That had been the plan. The surprise was supposed to be hers to give. But there they were, her father in his favorite Bears cap, her mother clutching a small American flag, and her younger sister holding a handmade Welcome Home Grace sign decorated with glitter and stars. Grace's composure finally broke. Tears welled in her eyes as she rushed forward, dropping her backpack on the terminal floor. Her family enveloped her in a group hug, all of them crying and laughing at once. "How did you know?" Grace managed to ask through tears as she held her mother tightly. "It's all over the news," her father explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Someone recognized your name from the story and called us. We couldn't not be here." A woman with a microphone approached cautiously, accompanied by a cameraman. "Staff Sergeant Wilson? Could we have a word about what happened on your flight today?" Before Grace could respond, a tall man in a crisp business suit stepped between them. "I'm Daniel Hartman, VP of Communications for the airline. Staff Sergeant Wilson has just returned from a 14-month deployment and is reuniting with her family. We'd appreciate giving them this moment privately." The reporter looked like she wanted to argue but ultimately backed away. Hartman turned to Grace. "Staff Sergeant, on behalf of the entire airline, I want to personally apologize for your experience today. What happened was unacceptable and directly violated our policies. Our CEO is very eager to speak with you when you're ready." Grace nodded, still trying to process everything happening around her. "Thank you. I'll be in touch." Thomas appeared at Grace's side, having given her space for the family reunion. "I hate to interrupt, but I thought you should know what's happening online." He showed her his phone screen, displaying a news website with a headline. "Airline bumps decorated soldier from first class. Social media responds." Below the headline was the photo of Grace sitting in economy class, looking dejected, alongside another photo someone had taken of her walking through the first-class cabin with Lisa. The article described how a passenger, unnamed, but clearly Thomas, had alerted the airline to the situation and sparked a social media campaign that had gone viral within hours. "It's not just about you anymore," Thomas explained gently. "It's become a conversation about how we treat military personnel, about corporate accountability, about doing the right thing even when no one's watching." He scrolled down to show more headlines from other sites, all covering the story. A small group of veterans approached, led by an older man with a Vietnam veteran's cap. "Staff Sergeant, we'd be honored if you'd say a few words to the folks who came out today. Nothing fancy, just whatever you'd like to share." Grace looked at her family. Her mother nodded encouragingly. "It's your moment, honey." Taking a deep breath, Grace stepped toward the gathered crowd. The news cameras turned to focus on her and the terminal fell surprisingly quiet. "I didn't expect any of this," Grace began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I just wanted to come home after a long deployment. What happened on the flight today was unfortunate, but it's been addressed. I appreciate everyone's support, but honestly, the only welcome home I needed was from these three right here." She gestured to her family. She paused, then continued. "That said, if what happened to me helps improve how airlines treat military personnel in the future, then something good will have come from it. Not just for me, but for all the service members traveling home to their families after doing their duty." The crowd applauded again. As Grace stepped back, Thomas caught her eye and gave her a thumbs up. She had struck exactly the right note, gracious, humble, but firm in her principles. An airline representative approached with a tablet. "Staff Sergeant Wilson, we've arranged transportation for you and your family. A car is waiting whenever you're ready. We've also been instructed to offer you and your family our airport lounge facilities, if you'd like some privacy before departing." Hartman added. Grace's father spoke up. "That's very kind, but I think we're ready to take our daughter home." As they began moving through the terminal, the crowd respectfully parted. Veterans saluted as Grace passed. Ordinary travelers who had heard what happened stopped to applaud. A group of young children on a school trip waved small American flags. Thomas fell into step beside them for a moment. "I have to catch a connecting flight, but I wanted to say it was an honor meeting you, Grace. I'll be in touch about that initiative we discussed." "I'd like that," Grace said, shaking his hand. "And thank you for everything." As Thomas disappeared into the terminal crowd, Grace's sister leaned in. "So who's the cute businessman?" she whispered teasingly. "Just someone who stood up when it mattered," Grace replied with a smile. The family made their way through the airport staff clearing a path and handling Grace's luggage. As they stepped outside into the Chicago afternoon sunshine, Grace took a deep breath of the sweet home air. What had started as a simple desire for a comfortable flight home had somehow turned into something much bigger. She wasn't sure how she felt about being the face of a viral story, but as the car pulled away from the curb, Grace realized one thing. Sometimes the journey home takes unexpected turns, But what matters most is who's waiting at the end. 3 weeks later, Grace sat in her parents' kitchen sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the wooden table. The house was quiet. Her parents had gone grocery shopping and her sister was at work. These peaceful moments had become precious to Grace as she adjusted to civilian life again. Her return home had been everything she'd hoped for, despite the unexpected public attention. The viral story had faded from the headlines within days, replaced by other news. Grace had politely declined most interview requests, preferring to focus on reconnecting with family and friends. She had, however, accepted a phone call from the airline's CEO, who had personally apologized and asked for her input on improving their policies regarding military personnel. A notification popped up on her screen, an email from Thomas Lee. Grace smiled as she opened it. They had stayed in touch since the flight, with Thomas keeping her updated on his military travel respect initiative. His latest message contained exciting news. Grace, great progress to report. My company's board unanimously approved the initiative yesterday. Starting next month, we're partnering with 3 major airlines, including yours from our memorable flight, to implement the program. When seats are available, service members will be upgraded at our company's expense. Best of all, 12 other corporations have expressed interest in joining the coalition. None of this would have happened without you. Your dignity and grace under pressure inspired a lot of people, myself included. On a personal note, I'll be in Chicago next week for meetings. Any chance you'd be free for coffee or lunch? I'd love to get your thoughts on the next phase of the initiative. All the best, Thomas. Grace's phone rang before she could reply. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was from Washington, D.C. Curious, she answered. Hello? Is this Staff Sergeant Grace Wilson? A professional-sounding woman asked. Yes, this is she, Grace replied. Good morning, Staff Sergeant. I'm calling from Senator Winter's office. The senator has been following your story and the changes it sparked in how airlines treat military personnel. She's impressed by the positive impact you've had and would like to invite you to a Veterans Affairs Committee hearing next month. They're discussing legislation to establish industry-wide standards for military travel. Grace was momentarily speechless. Senator Winters was a well-respected advocate for military families and veterans' rights. The senator believes your first-hand experience would be valuable testimony, the woman continued. Your story has already influenced corporate policy. Now it could help shape federal guidelines. I'm honored, Grace managed to say, but I'm not sure what I would contribute. I'm just one soldier who had a bad experience that turned out okay in the end. That's exactly why the senator wants you there. You're not a professional advocate or lobbyist. You're someone who simply stood up for what was right and it made a difference. People relate to that. Grace promised to consider the invitation and said she would call back within a few days. After hanging up, she sat staring at her coffee, trying to process this unexpected development. When she'd saved up for that first-class seat, she could never have imagined it would lead to speaking before a Senate committee. Her phone chimed with another notification. This time it was a message from Andy, her former squad leader who was still deployed. Wilson, you're famous over here. The brass actually called a meeting about your airline situation. New travel policy coming down from the top. They're saying all military personnel on official orders will now get priority for upgrades when available. Several airlines already on board. You started something good, kid. Attached to the message was a photo of Andy and several other soldiers she'd served with, all giving thumbs up and cheesy grins. Grace laughed out loud at their antics but felt a surge of pride knowing her experience was making things better for her fellow service members. The back door opened, and her parents walked in carrying grocery bags. Her father noticed her expression immediately. What's got you smiling like that? He asked, setting the bags on the counter. Grace showed them the photo from Andy, then told them about the senator's invitation. Her mother's eyes widened. Washington? That's wonderful, honey, she said. Are you going to do it? I don't know, Grace admitted. It's a bit intimidating. I'm not a public speaker. Her father sat down across from her. Remember when you were 10 and that kid in the neighborhood was bullying your sister? You marched right up to him even though he was 2 years older and a head taller, and told him to stop. Grace smiled at the memory. I was terrified the whole time, but you did it anyway, her father said, because it was the right thing to do. This is no different. You're standing up for people who might not be able to stand up for themselves. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Whatever you decide, we're proud of you. Later that afternoon, Grace sat on the back porch swing, thinking about everything that had happened since that flight. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Ran into Tim from high school. He's a pilot for the airline now, says they completely overhauled their military passenger policies after the Grace Wilson incident. His words, not mine. They're using it as a case study in their training now. You're basically a legend. Grace shook her head in amazement. What had begun as a personal disappointment had somehow transformed into something much larger than herself. She opened her laptop and began typing a reply to Thomas, accepting his lunch invitation. Then she drafted a response to the senator's office, agreeing to testify at the hearing. Finally, she opened a new document and began writing down her thoughts about the entire experience. What had happened, how it made her feel, and what she believed needed to change. If she was going to speak up, she wanted to be prepared. 2 months later, Grace stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C. Behind her was a banner reading Military Travel Respect Coalition, with the logos of over 30 major corporations and airlines. Camera flashes popped as she addressed the crowd of corporate executives, military officials, and media representatives. What started as a simple misunderstanding on a flight home from deployment has grown into something I never could have imagined, Grace said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Today I'm proud to announce that this coalition has already upgraded more than 5,000 service members on flights across the country in just the first month of operation. Applause filled the room. Grace spotted Thomas in the front row, beaming with pride. Beside him sat Senator Winters, who had successfully championed legislation establishing minimum standards for how airlines must accommodate military personnel. This isn't about special treatment, Grace continued. It's about respect. When our men and women in uniform are returning from serving their country, often after months or years away from their loved ones, the journey home matters. A small kindness, like a more comfortable seat on a long flight, can make all the difference. More applause followed. As Grace concluded her remarks, she caught sight of her family standing at the back of the room. They had flown in to surprise her, just as she had once planned to surprise them. Her father gave her a thumbs up and her mother wiped away a tear. After the event, as photographers captured images of Grace shaking hands with airline executives signing the coalition pledge, a young woman in an Army uniform approached her. Staff Sergeant Wilson, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm deploying next week, and knowing that programs like this will be in place when I return means a lot. Grace felt a lump form in her throat. Safe travels, soldier. And a safe return. Later, as she sat at dinner with her family, Thomas, and several coalition members, Grace reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. A simple denial of a seat she had paid for had sparked a movement that was now changing policies nationwide. A toast, Thomas said, raising his glass, to Grace Wilson, who reminded an entire industry that sometimes doing the right thing is simply about respecting the people who serve. Everyone raised their glasses, but Grace shook her head modestly. I think we should toast to something larger, she suggested. To standing up when something isn't right, even when it's uncomfortable, and to the power of one voice to start a conversation that needs to be had. As the dinner continued, Grace's phone lit up with a message from Andy, who had finally returned home himself, just landed in Dallas. Guess what? First-class upgrade, courtesy of your coalition. The seat is amazing, but the respect it represents means even more. You did good, Wilson. Really good, Grace smiled. Tucky.